happy to be here. And today's music was performed by Mr. Larry Pride on the saxophone. And Mr. James Baker
Yes, ma'am.
on piano.
Yes, ma'am.
Let's give them a round of applause. We are so thrilled to have this ambiance of elegance. We don't have that in our other seminars in Lansing. We now know we need to import some of this talent, right?
Amen. Yes.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're really happy to be here to share information. Our mission at Michigan State University is really generating knowledge and doing translational research and getting the information out. Today's topic is one on the interface between brain research and policies related to juvenile justice. So there are all kinds of people in this room, I think, who are very concerned about the youth in Michigan and some of the policies we have. So I'm glad that on short notice, you're here to be with us. We did this parts of this presentation. I'd like to introduce you to the Associate Director of Michigan Council for Crime and Delinquency. We have been co-conspirators in pulling this together, and I'm glad that she could make the journey down here today. She has been working in the field on this for many years, so we're very thrilled to have her here. For me, I am very thin on knowledge about this area because the topic gets picked by state legislators. And they say, next year, these are hot topics. That's what we want to hear from. So we can jump from juvenile justice to economic policies to health. And so I've dabbled in many different parts of the knowledge base here. But nevertheless, let's get this going. We're part of 24 states that offer these seminars called the Family Impact Seminars. And there's a little flyer in your thing that tells you what it is. We do these seminars once or twice a year, depends on whether there is an election or not, and that seems to determine whether people have time to participate. But these are things that enable us to share knowledge. We get people who know about the topic well and who can present well. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce one of the colleagues that we have here today. She is in my department, and we're so proud of her, Dr. Lori Hoisington. And she is so different from so many of our faculty members because she comes with a background in radiology. Most of us are in family or we're in human development, but we are not one steeped in what fMRI, and she'll explain what that is, about looking at brain imaging. But for this topic, it is so critical for you to understand some basics, and she's excellent in getting you up to speed on that. Lori came to us with, she was a senior MRI technologist and instructor in a research team that used the fMRI imaging. And her decision to join our department was to kind of get more knowledgeable about the interaction of the brain activity and what human development is all about. She is currently an instructor and advisor at MSU, where her specialization is family studies with healthcare components and brain development. So please welcome Dr. Hoisington.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today and an honor, and I want to thank you all for joining us. This is a topic that's very dear to me, along with its intersection with juvenile justice. So we'll move forward through a tutorial, if you will. It's a little bit of a primer on brain development of adolescents, and then how this affects the justice system, or how it should affect the justice system. Of goal of this presentation is to make you become more informed consumers of neuroscience research. Historically, we've developed new technologies that begin to allow us to look at the human brain. I think MRI became available around 1983. I started in MRI in 1987. We could see very small areas of the human brain with great detail. Shortly following that, we developed a way to image the brain in virtually a real time, if you will, where we could see activity in the brain almost instantly in response to stimulus that we presented to a person laying in an MRI scanner. This replaced post-mortem studies in providing us information about the brain structure and function of adolescents. So it was a much more impressive and telling technology than what we had relied on up until that point. Our goal is to translate this research into policy, and I'm here to disseminate some of the information we've gained so that you all can share this and do that within your context. This is the way a brain looks on MRI. These are very thin slices, and when I say slices, sections of the brain, if you will. We can view the brain from the bottom up, and this would be like a 5 millimeter slice of bread. It's very, very thin. To give you an idea, most of you probably know 2.54 inches is a centimeter, and this is 5 millimeters, so very, very thin. We're looking at the brain from below on this view, we're looking at the brain from behind on this view, and from the side on this view. The reason it's important for us to be able to image this way, I just lost the mic, didn't I? Can you still hear me? Still coming through? Sorry. Okay, is that better? One of the batteries just went. I apologize. Okay, should I speak out? Okay. All right, we'll replace the batteries. In the meantime, I'll continue. All right. So the reason it's important to image in thin sections in multiple directions is because in order to be meaningful, information about activity needs to be precise. There are structures in the brain are very, very small. Some of them just millimeters in dimensions. If we're going to positively understand where signal's coming from, we have to be able to localize it in 3 dimensions. MRI allows us to do this. Chico, can you take this off of the wheel for me? Should I just pull it out?
Yep.
We have a wheel on our remote here, and it's not working well for me. That's better. Okay. The brain consists of 2 different types of tissue, essentially. Gray matter, which is the nerve cell, along with its little extensions that communicate from other nerves and to other nerves. And then the white matter beneath it that is like the superhighway for signal to travel. We need this white matter in order to get the signal from the brain cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain, to other parts of the body and the spine, through the spinal cord, out to your arms and legs, and then signal again back up to the brain. So it's essential that we have this network of brain cells and the connections, which comprise the white matter. Now, infants are born with nearly the total number of brain cells they'll have in their lifetime. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? During the gestation between, I believe it's 3 and 6 months, there are more nerve cells and connections than any other time in your life. And that's before you're even born. Shortly after birth, infants begin to lose a lot of those connections. And this is important to know because there's a second wave of this connectivity that overgrows again just before puberty. So just before adolescence, 9 or 10 years old, an individual will suddenly develop this massive overgrowth of connections again. And connections are possibilities for new, let's say new skills, changes in behavior. It's just an endless possibility for creating new neural pathways that lead to different behavior. So this is very important to understand. Just before puberty, individuals have this ability to change. This is an image of a simple neuron, a nerve cell. The nerve cells make up what we call the gray matter in the human brain. The nerve cells comprised primarily of the nerve cell body, which is this round area here. And then these little short extensions, those are dendrites. Those extensions are receptors, if you will, to receive signal from neighboring nerve cells. This is how they communicate. The longer extension here is called an axon. Those can be up to 1 meter long. Axons can be very long, and they're covered in cells that serve as insulators. And the reason this is important is like an electrical cord, these insulators will help the signal travel more quickly from the brain to the other parts of the body. In fact, this is noted as myelin. This network of cells that cover the axons is myelination. This will speed the signal up to 100 times faster. So that's a significant increase in speed. Okay, thank you. Now, can we pull this screen down anymore? I want to show you the connections if I can.
No, you can't.
Okay, all right, that's okay. Nerve cells communicate through electrical chemical connections. Those are called synapses. And the dendrite of one nerve cell will synapse with an axon, a node on an axon of another nerve cell. This is how the signal travels through the brain and the rest of the body. Interestingly, as I mentioned, there's a second wave of overgrowth of neural connections just before puberty. This is especially important for adolescents because that provides a predisposition for change, if you will. As the brain develops, though, the synapses are eliminated very, very rapidly. I believe it's at the point of 0.7% per day that you lose the connections. A very rapid rate. So at a time when they're most pliable to changes in behavior, they're also losing connections very, very rapidly. So the faster they are exposed, the sooner they're exposed to environmental factors and positive role models during that time, the higher the likelihood that they will imitate those role models and pave neural pathways so that that behavior is set in their own brain. So as the connections are pruned, they are becoming more able to perform certain behaviors. They're getting better at it. So, characteristics of the adolescent brain. The gray matter volume is highest in early adolescence and rapidly declines over the period of early to mid-adolescence. Interestingly, different parts of the brain will mature at different rates. And the parts of the brain that are more responsible for emotions and socialization mature before the parts of the brain that control executive function. And I'll explain a little bit more about the regulation of the front part of the brain, that regulation process of executive function. Development continues, though, not only during early and mid-adolescence, but what we've learned through research is development of the white matter in particular continues through the early to mid-20s. This is a very significant finding, and that this is something we started to discover in the 90s, and a lot of more research is being done on it now to try to fine-tune what we know. I started to tell you a bit about myelination, or the substance that coats the longer connections in the brain. The myelin is formed of glial cells, for those of you who are in medicine or healthcare, in the central nervous system. And the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. The cells wrap around the axon and form a continuous insulating layer along the entire axon. The myelination, however, occurs in the middle of the brain associated with more emotions, and the area that you may have heard referred to, the amygdala. That's the road rage part of the brain. So the superhighway connects to the emotional center before it connects to the center in the front of the brain that can control impulses and make rational decisions. The reason it's important to know this is an adolescent who sees sensory information comes in through the vision, goes to the middle of the brain, and then from that point it's got to go someplace else for processing. Well, this emotional center is much closer to the middle of the brain than the front part of the brain that's responsible for rational thinking and controlling impulses. There is, in a way, a short circuit in the brain as information comes in. It tends to want to go to the amygdala first. One, because the superhighway is complete to the amygdala, but also the distance is shorter. So those things are important to recognize in the adolescent brain. It's an important characteristic. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for something that we call executive function. And I told you a little bit about that with the rational decision making, controlling impulses. Other things that it's responsible for are multitasking, establishing priorities, and how about this one? Changing behavior as the situation changes. That's very important because adolescents are not real good at recognizing when to modify their behavior. They're thrill seekers, as we'll talk in just a couple of minutes. They want to receive instant gratification rather than waiting for that gratification. So they tend not to recognize when it is appropriate to change behavior. Another thing that the prefrontal cortex regulates is empathy. Being able to feel the feelings of another person, project or I guess perceive their feelings. Adolescents are not very well equipped to be able to recognize and to feel what other people are feeling. This is what we call a sagittal brain. It's a brain from the side. And there are several interesting structural areas in this brain. This could be a brain of an adult or a child. I mean, structurally, the brain always has these different parts. It's just the level of maturation that varies. This area that in the middle consists of white matter, and that connects the two halves of the brain. That's the corpus callosum. The cerebellum is responsible for fine-tuning motor skills. The ventral striatum is an area that's associated with reward. And then here's the prefrontal cortex in the front of the brain, and that's related to the executive function. Without the superhighway connected in this prefrontal cortex, adolescents are challenged to be able to perform a rational behavior and to sense appropriate behavior for situations. This often leads to bad choices. Adolescent emotions is something that goes hand in hand with behavior. The gonadal hormones, testosterone and estrogen, tend to flood the brain during adolescence and have an indirect effect on production of a neurotransmitter known as serotonin. Well, the end result of this new combination of hormones, if you will, is that adolescents are much more easily excited. And they're not only much more rapidly, easily excited, but what we call the flash point occurs more quickly. And that might be equated to something, we might say a blow up, where they just lose it. That flash point occurs sooner than an adult because of chemical reactions that are going on in the human brain at that age of development. Thrill seeking is another behavior that we see at this time. And that's simply because the hormones are saturate the brain in such a way that the adolescent achieves a type of a high, if you will. And they are more prone to addictions during this time. They strive to achieve that feeling. And the more they achieve it, probably the more they want more of it. It takes more hormones to achieve the same levels as an adult, levels of pleasure as an adult at that point in their development. It puts them particularly at risk for becoming addicted to alcohol, drugs, any gambling, anything that could become an addiction. So adolescents at that age are particularly predisposed to becoming addicted to these things, simply because of the hormones that are flowing through their brain at that time. Researcher Yergel and Todd conducted an experiment showing a frightened face to several adolescents. I think there were probably 18 adolescents and 16 adults. The adolescents' age range was 10 to 18 years old. Surprisingly, the adolescents who looked at this face responded that this person was surprised or angry more often than not. They only described this expression as frightened 50% of the time. The adults, in addition, the adolescents' activity that occurred when they described that as angry or surprised occurred primarily in the amygdala, the emotional center of the brain that is kind of a knee-jerk center, if you will. And that, again, that relates back to that short circuit that we have from sensory impulses that come into the brain. The adults, however, processed that face more with the prefrontal cortex. And the adults recognized that as frightened 100% of the time. But another really fascinating feature of this study was, as individuals aged from 10 toward 18, they started more often processing that face in the frontal region and correctly identifying that face expression as frightened. So we could almost see from this study where the processing of facial expression moved from the amygdala a little at a time as they aged up to the prefrontal cortex, which would be the cognitive center with rational decision making and comparing risk versus reward, things like that. Now this is a edited version of some images that appeared for some studies on Spock and Kirk. And this is kind of a fun study. The neural circuits that govern behavior, social recognition, emotion, and reward are located in the front half of the brain. Researchers have tried to explain how these two systems work together, being the cognitive system and the emotional system, by saying that Kurt lives in the emotional system of the brain. Kurt is responsive to threats and rewards. And Kurt is very quick to send messages to Spock saying, help, we have threats, or great, we have rewards, let's do something right away. But because the front part of the brain has not completely formed that superhighway, the signal from Kurt's emotions bottlenecks and just completely overwhelms Spock. And it becomes very difficult to make good decisions from the emotional input that's coming into the prefrontal cortex. With this overwhelming amount of signal that's coming in, adolescents have a very difficult time processing everything in the prefrontal cortex and responding with appropriate behavior. Several studies have been done and repeated the scenario that we're seeing in where signals process between adolescents and adults. And this is a diagram that was formed based on the results of those studies. Dopamine is another naturally occurring hormone in the human brain and body, floods the brain during pre-adolescence and adolescence. Dopamine is responsible for a lot of different feelings and functions. Feelings of pleasure, behavior and cognition, sleep, mood, moving, gross motor movement, learning and memory. There's controversy among researchers, though, whether there's too much or too little dopamine in the adolescent brain. And there are two different theories that ride along side by side without agreement. So I think we've just learned to live with the two different theories. But what it is important to know is that dopamine interacts with the reward center of the brain and again causes adolescents to require increasing amounts of stimulation to achieve the same high, if you will, that they received before this dopamine level changed, which would be equivalent to the pleasure that an adult feels in response to certain situations. So we're placing the adolescent at a higher risk for risky behavior because they constantly want to achieve that dopamine high. So they increase the input of any activity that leads them in that direction. This is also a strong contributor to risk-taking and developing addictions for adolescents. Adolescents who practice drug use, gambling, and video gaming in particular are especially prone to addictions at that phase of development, simply because the chemicals are such that they saturate the brain in a way that continually invites the behavior that they've started. And the wiring in the prefrontal cortex is constantly paving new paths. So they're practicing drug use, for example. That's the behavior that's going to be permanently impressioned into their brain. That's the neural circuit they're going to develop in response to that behavior. So it's like being driven by a chemical. Then they participate in this behavior, and then it becomes habit, and it's wired into their brain, if you will. Now, interestingly, with the addictions, or even just the behavior that is undesirable, adolescents frequently know they're not doing the right thing, but they can't stop. They recognize this is not right. That cognitively, by the age of 15, their center is developed to recognize right from wrong. But there's this battle going on between the reward system and the cognitive system and the emotions that leads them into this other behavior. And I imagine that it's probably a feeling somewhat of imprisonment where they want to get out of it, but they know it's wrong, but they simply can't figure out how to do it, how to change their behavior. I suppose this is where social structure and scaffolding would come in, because the more you can help them practice this behavior, the better. I talked a little bit about the sex hormones already and how they interact with the reward system, so I won't go into great detail on this. But there's one important factor that we should focus on for a minute, and that is the factor of how peers, the presence of peers, affect risk-taking. We've known for some time that adolescents, in the presence of their peers, tend to drive fast, use drugs. I think before fMRI and some of the other studies, we weren't real clear about why that happened. But we do know that when adolescents are around their friends, that their risk-taking increases twofold. They take twice as many risks as an adult. There's some speculation that the social acceptance stimulates the same reward center that non-social activities stimulate. So it's speculated that when an adolescent participates in a certain risk-taking activity with a friend, it's actually exciting the same reward center that's activated when they take drugs. So this would explain physiologically why adolescents are prone to taking more risks when in the presence of their peers. This is the stoplight study. This was conducted by, I believe, by Steinberg. It's a functional magnetic resonance imaging study, kind of what I was telling you about, where we're kind of looking at the brain in real time. So he imaged a group of adolescents and put them in an MRI scanner and put some special goggles on them so they could be virtually driving a car. And then he presented a yellow light to the individuals. Well, when the individuals came upon the yellow light in the presence of friends, they took more risks, twice as many more risks. However, when they came upon the light and they were alone with no friends, they would operate at the level of an adult. And that was quite interesting, because that mirrors the information we have about the cognitive structure being fully developed by the time an individual is around 15 years old. And that's give or take a little bit of time, and females tend to develop a little quicker than males. But this study was an eye-opener, because the adults were measured in their risk-taking, and the adolescents, who were not in the presence of peers, performed essentially the same as the adults. Again, this reinforces the idea that the presence of peers increases risk-taking for adolescents. So what are some things we know now about the adolescent brain compared to the adult brain? Well, we know that it's not developed as thoroughly, let's say, as the adult brain. The prefrontal cortex still does not have its superhighway completed at that age. Because the prefrontal cortex is still developing, it places adolescents at a disadvantage for understanding mistakes and learning from their experience. It reduces their ability to engage in logical reasoning, again, because there's this competition going on between the reward center, the emotional center, and the cognitive center. And they're more susceptible to peer pressure. They're higher risk for reckless and sensation or thrill-seeking adventures. So we should ask ourselves, based on this information, should juvenile offenders be held responsible for their behaviors? And that's a tough question, because obviously we can't just give them an open ticket to perform however they wish and then just say, well, you were an adolescent, so we're not going to hold you accountable. There has to be something in between, a way to manage them without placing them at undue risk for behavior that will get them into trouble. So we have to consider their competency, and that is not only their physical competency, but whether they can contextualize their actions. And what that means is, what is their mental state while they're committing the crime. And the mental state is a factor of all of these things we've discussed. Rewards, the chemical changes, the myelinating, the pattern of myelination being incomplete in the front. So there are gray matters developing first in the front of their brain, but the white matter highways are last to develop. And there's about a dozen years where there's this mismatch between the physical ability of their brain and the nerve cells to conduct versus their ability to send the correct messages for that behavior. So this brings us to some questions about neuroscience and how that it should inform us about juvenile justice. So what types of things do we consider in juvenile justice based on these findings? It does not imply, these findings do not imply that adolescents should not be held accountable. Clearly they have to be held accountable, or we have a whole group of loose cannons running around in society with no control and no management at all. They cannot, their level of brain development cannot be used to assess the level of maturity. There's a level of cognitive function that's going to occur regardless of their social emotional center and their risk-taking and rewards. However, diminished responsibility should be considered in sentencing. These factors should be taken into account when we decide what the appropriate punishment, if you will, is for that type of behavior, given that level of development. We know that the correctional environment can influence the developmental trajectory. I think Kristen's going to talk more about that today. We also know that opportunities for changing behavior more positively will assist with maturing. So we know that they're pliable at that age and they can change. They can be rehabilitated. We do know that. Here's a problem that I focused on for several years through several court decisions, actually. We have executed 364 juvenile offenders in the United States. I can tell you that other countries tend not to do that. We had a ruling in 2005. Justice Kennedy ruled that execution of juvenile offenders is not constitutional. It violates the 8th Amendment of cruel and unusual punishment. So we had a lot of juvenile offenders on death row at that time. We also have a lot of other juvenile offenders who did not commit crimes such as murder who were serving life without parole. The result of this decision to abolish execution of juvenile offenders, along with the life without parole individuals we already had, has left us with about 2,570 juvenile offenders who are currently serving life without parole. That's a high number. And I think I'm quoting correctly to say that the rest of the world has only 12. And I don't mean 1,200, I mean 12 serving life without parole. I believe only Somalia is the only other country in the world that currently assigns this sentence to juvenile offenders. So sentencing practices are under examination at this time to determine the fate of these individuals, whether they should continue to serve life without parole, whether they should be reassigned a new sentence based on these things we've learned about brain development. Our juvenile justice policy has been driven over the last 10 years by a few important decisions from the high courts. I mentioned Roper versus Simmons. That was a case of a juvenile offender murdering somebody. Justice Kennedy said it's not constitutional to execute this individual, and we will apply that to all the other juvenile offenders who have, committed homicide or killed somebody. Graham versus Florida in 2010 went a step further and said if a juvenile offender has not murdered somebody, then you should not be able to give them life without parole. That's pretty much just as cruel as giving them executing them. So then we came to the understanding that, okay, juvenile offenders cannot be sentenced to mandatory life without parole if they haven't murdered somebody. Well, a couple of years later, we had 2 more cases that arrived at the high courts for decision. And these cases determined that a state cannot impose life without parole for juvenile homicide offenders on a mandatory basis. Meaning, if a juvenile offender murders somebody, you cannot automatically sentence them to life without parole. Each case should be determined on a case-by-case basis, on an individual basis, based on that individual. Consider all the factors around the environmental factors, the developmental factors, the age, their potential to be rehabilitated. Those things should all be considered and without an automatic sentence of life without parole. The high courts ruled from that decision that states should also review all of the juvenile offenders who were currently serving life without parole and reconsider their sentence. Michigan is one of 4 states that has not applied this decision retroactively. We're a bit, I would say, in violation, if you will, of a high court decision that we should review all of these life without parole juvenile offenders. So we're still waiting to see what comes out of that. But as of right now, Michigan does not retroactively review those juvenile offenders to reconsider their sentence. Now, the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child explicitly prohibits assignment of life without parole for juvenile offenders, so we are also in violation of that. This is based on accepted purposes that are supposed to guide sentencing, and I'll briefly go over these 4 purposes. The first is deterrence. Well, we've learned that deterrence, in other words, the fear of being sentenced as an adult, does not have a significant effect on adolescent behavior. Deterrence is just not working the way it's supposed to in other situations. Retribution means you have to pay for your crime. Well, retribution must also consider the state of mind of the individual when they committed the crime, and clearly these individuals do not have the same state of mind as an adult who commits the crime. Third, incapacitation, meaning keeping them locked up. This does not make sense once an individual is rehabilitated. It's very expensive to keep them locked up. If we can rehabilitate the juvenile offender, then it makes more dollars and cents for us to figure out a way to get them out of that expensive system of incarceration. And then finally, rehabilitation. For reasons I've explained pretty thoroughly here, adolescents, juvenile offenders, have a high possibility of being rehabilitated if they're immersed in the correct social environment with good role models, if they practice a different behavior. So rehabilitation is higher possibility for a juvenile offender than it is for an adult offender. So the 4 purposes that should guide sentencing do not lead to suggest that juvenile offenders should be sentenced to life without parole, or certainly not execution. Now, moving forward, what should we do with this information then? We've talked about landmark discussions, we've talked about the developing adolescent. How do we use it? What should we do with it? I think, from the perspective of most researchers, it's agreed that developmental science should inform the way we manage juvenile offenders. Can't dictate it, but it should certainly inform the decisions. We should consider their level of development and their predisposition for risk-taking when we decide whether they're culpable of their crime or to what level they're culpable, what degree. We should consider their mental state and their competence to stand trial, the consequences of sanctions on their future behavior and development. We know that prisons are not turning these kids around, if you will. That typically they learn more activity rather than less activity related to crime. And then we should also consider restorative justice, which assumes culpability and focuses on restitution and citizenship. That goes hand in hand with the descriptions I just gave on the adolescent's state of mind when they committed the crime. Restitution should consider what they take, how they violate another individual, but you also have to consider the state of their mind when they did that. And juvenile offenders should not be managed the same as adults in criminal justice system. So with that, that's the conclusion of my presentation. I'm going to have to ask whether I should turn it over to.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll take questions at the end, and I'm getting sick. Thank you very much, Laura. Our next, I'd like to introduce somebody who made this possible to be in this beautiful room and the music, and that is Chuck Rivers from the Intergovernmental Affairs of Michigan State University. He's based here. My friend David Bertram, I call him my friend because he gave me his cell number. I know very little about legislators, and whenever I run into a roadblock, he gets a call. So I'd like to introduce you to David Bertram.
Thank you. You know, we all should really appreciate Esther's work because I don't know that you're going to be putting many more of these on, are you? She's going to be retiring in a few months. That's what I'm getting at. But, I did want to just take a minute to say thank you all for coming, and I do want to mention the special guest that we have who just arrived, and I don't know if she's able to stay till the end, so I wanted to make sure she got recognized right now. We have Representative Sherry Gay Nogo, and she's in the back. And thanks for coming. Just a couple quick notes. She was named the Urban Education Advisor to the House Democrats. A freshman, you've got, 4 months under your belt, roughly?
Yeah.
Probably feels like 4 years already, doesn't it?
It does.
But 4 months.
I'm working with Chuck all these years. It's only a
One of the shining freshmen in the legislature this year, so thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
We have 2 more speakers coming up, and I think, like in the news show, they tell you what you can expect. And so I think brain research was a very good beginning of sharing what we know. I have a fondness for our next speaker, Lois DeMott. She's a parent, and she is an amazing person who has, I think, contributed to helping other families in a situation that can be very, very trying. Lois is the founder and coordinator of the Family Participation Program, which provides critical information and support to families and friends of people incarcerated in Michigan. Prior to her work, Lois served as an administrator with the Association for Children's Mental Health and as president and co-founder of Citizens for Prison Reform, a statewide grassroots organization that supports, educates, and unifies families, friends, and citizens seeking reform in the criminal justice system. She is definitely an outstanding person that has been recognized. In 2009, she was awarded the National Mother of Distinction Award by the Campaign for Youth Justice and National Juvenile Justice Network. She received an associate's degree from Argybright Business College in Battle Creek, Michigan. Please welcome Lois DeVos.
Thank you. Is this good? Can you hear me? So I'm here to kind of follow up with what you just heard with a personal journey into and through the system. I'm going to share my son's personal journey and as well what we saw in regards to many of the other juveniles that we met along the way and others in the system who primarily I'm going to focus on the facts of mental illness because that was the system in which my son was placed inside the prison. So this has become one of my favorite quotes. Our lives begin to end the day that we become silent about things that matter. I used to be a person who thought you do the crime, you do the time. I used to be a transcriptionist, transcribing the MRIs that Lori loves to read. And I had no clue I'd be doing this work one day. I had no idea that my son would become a prisoner within the Michigan Department of Corrections at a very young age, and that I would experience this. So it has led me to great passion and purpose after learning what goes on. So here is a photo page that we put together for a parole hearing. And I just want to say every single family and every single prisoner in this system has their own very personal story. And ours is often very different than that of others. So this shows you my son, Kevin, who had wonderful opportunities growing up of sports, of vacation trips. But at a very young age, from the time that he was 3 and 4 years old, we started seeing emotional impairments. He would have these outbursts and rages, and we started seeking help at that time. And we sought treatment, psychological evaluations, therapy. And by the time that he was 10 years old, he had actually been out of home. We decided to have him go and live with other family out in the country because they thought the farm environment would fix the problems that we were seeing, and that didn't work. By the time he was 11, he was diagnosed as bipolar. He had, at that time, had an inpatient psychiatric stay, and our community mental health in the county in which we lived started telling us that we needed to start calling the police and get him involved in the court system in order to get the services. That is where the funding was at for the services that he was needing. Unfortunately, as parents, we didn't know where to turn. We were becoming exhausted, and so we followed that advice, and it became quickly enmeshed in the juvenile justice system. Once he was inside the system there, he learned about gangs and drugs and many more horrific things than what we ever imagined. So when he was 13 years old, he committed a crime. And that crime, he was driven by strangers. When he was manic, he would take off running. He wound up with strangers. He owed them money. And so they drove him up to a little pizza store, and they gave him a toy gun. And he went in to hold up the people in the pizza store, and he got scared, and he ran out, and he didn't take any money. But here in Michigan, that gave him a free ticket to a blended sentence. And that meant that he was charged as an adult, and the judge held over his head a blended sentence, which meant they were trying to deter him by saying, we're going to give you one last chance, and you have to go to this program, and if you're not successful in this program we're going to send you to, then you will go into adult prison. Well, the program they sent him to out in Iowa, and he had previously been sent out of state 2 other times prior to going to Iowa, they said right on their papers that they do not take kids with bipolar. So the court basically sent him to a place that could not provide him the treatment that he needed. He only made it there 7 months, and they sent him back, and he was then sentenced into the Michigan Department of Corrections at the age of 15. You can see here, this was his sentencing day. We hadn't been able to see him for a couple of weeks. We didn't know why. So when we showed up at court this day, along with the Battle Creek Enquirer, who took this photo, his case was very well published, even at the age of 13. They gave his name, and his photographs and everything were in the papers. So that day at court, he showed up in this Bam Bam suit, and he was in that, and he'd been held in the county jail in segregation because he was trying to slit his wrists with spoons. The judge told us that day that our son would receive the services that he needed for his mental health inside the prison system. And what we learned and what we know now is often that judges do not truly know what kind of services and helps are available inside the prison system. This is a photographer, Richard Ross, who has done some fabulous work. So inside the system, my son only made it about 7 months up at Lapeer, where all of the youth have to go. And I will say that things have changed since the time that he went in. This was back in 2007. So there are PREA, Prison Rape Elimination Acts. You'll hear more about that from Kristen. But there are many things that have occurred since that time that the youth are somewhat more protected. But at the time when he went in, what I can tell you is the youth were not separated from the adults. He was with adults up to age 26 out in the yard and at Chow. And he only made it 7 months there, and he started getting all of these tickets, sanctions, misconducts, and he would have his spirals. And so he wound up in the adult psychiatric inpatient prison, which was then Huron Valley. And once he was in that setting, he started begging us to help these juveniles. These letters we got out from 2 juveniles. The one on the left was a 14-year-old who had the mentality of a 6-year-old. And he sent this letter out asking me to get this to his grandmother. And so this kind of really began my work of becoming an advocate. The letter on the right is from a young man who was 16 years old. He was placed in the mental health program at one of the prisons, yet he was held in his cell 23 hours a day. He was let out to a caged yard for 1 hour. He was not getting the mental health services. He wasn't gotten out to groups. And he himself recognized that there was a violation of his rights. He was writing asking for help. And yet another youth, and this is a photograph just to show you how young he looked. This was a year before he was sentenced into prison. He was sentenced at age 15. So I began doing as my son asked. I started reaching out and searching the internet for other organizations and for groups and trying to connect and find and learn how to best advocate. And I share this with you because I think everyone needs to know the reality of what goes on inside of our prison system. I want to tell you, number one, this is not what happens to everybody. And number two, that there are very good staff and employees who work inside this system, but they are far and few between. They become calloused. It's a very large system, and often people who are very vulnerable with mental illness, the youth, fall between the cracks. So I went to a rally. I learned of American Friends Service Committee, so I went to a rally in 2008, and that was in memory of Timothy Souders and Jeffrey Clark, both of who lost their lives inside the system. They both were mentally ill. They were placed in long-term segregation, and both of them actually died from dehydration. Timothy Souders' story, you can go out and Google on 60 Minutes. He was restrained for 72 hours. During that time, there were 36 employees who walked in and out of his cell. Only one of them lost their job due to his death. And then I also learned of Anthony McManus in the upper right-hand corner. And the thing that amazed me was that he died 1 year previous to Timothy Souders. So just 1 year previous, we had a mentally ill man who starved to death up in the Upper Peninsula, yet the system could not recognize the need for change. And what I feared most happened next. My son wound up in long-term segregation. During this time, he was going in between the inpatient psychiatric prisons to the other inpatient psychiatric treatment units that they had, and then he would have a breakdown, and so he was constantly being moved from facility to facility. And then they determined that he was too difficult to manage, and for the safety of others, they chose to send him to Ionia Maximum Security Prison, where he was in solitary. And there, he and the doctor decided that perhaps it would be best if he went off from his medications to see how he was at baseline. And he deteriorated. And I knew that he was not going to, he wasn't going to live. He had become a severe cutter. And so the photograph in the bottom right-hand corner are the photographs that I got out of my son after being told that they no longer could use 4- and 5-point restraints inside the prison system, and I knew exactly what he was describing was 4- and 5-point restraints. So through the Freedom of Information Act, I acquired these photos. So this was his treatment, the helmet and the chains. There's actually 2 sets of shackles on his feet that are not shown here. This was his treatment for banging his head on the wall. Once they are taken out of the inpatient psychiatric unit, they cannot be given medications as needed. They can only receive medication in the morning and at night. So if they need something to calm them down, they can't be given that during that time. A couple of other things that I want to point out, that my son's minimum sentence was 5 months because of the time that he served in the detention facility and in Iowa. So he went into prison with a minimum of 5-month sentence. And actually, 2 or 3 months after he went to prison, I was still very green. I didn't even know that ARUS was an acronym for a position in the prison. I thought it was a lady's name. So I showed up for his first parole hearing, and we only knew a week before and hadn't put together any information. But the parole board member recognized that he should not be there. He said, this has to be wrong. This says your son's 15 and he has mental illness. What is he doing here? And so he right away said, I'm going to give him a D47 release, which means a release with mental health services in place. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the prison system stating, we're really sorry to tell you, but your son can't leave prison for 2 more years because he's not old enough to go down to the prison where they do the reentry programming to get them out. And I just said, okay. Now, had it been today, that would not have happened. That would have not occurred. I would have went to legislative members. I would have went way up the top to work to get him out. But I didn't know. I did not know at that time. I think some of the other things that I would like to point out is that all of the youth operate under adult policy within this system. There was a youth prison. They closed that prison many years before my son wound up there, and yet they've never developed or have any type of policy or guidelines regarding the youth that are there. They are all treated as if they're adults. And in fact, when I would call in, I would be told, well, your son chose to commit an adult crime, so therefore that makes him an adult. That is incorrect. In regards to our law, their medical and mental health, they are not an adult until they turn 18 years old. And so I had to educate them. All of the juveniles that I shared those stories with, they are still all inside the prison system serving time. And what I really learned as I looked around is that families are often walled off and excluded from the system and not given the information that they need. And we believe that what families need most are support and not to be isolated and shamed. Each family has their very unique story, but what I have found is often families feel so overwhelmed. It's such a huge system. How do you get the information that you need? When you call in, yes, there are some staff that treat you well, but often you're not treated well. And so families often will feel like they just need to kind of disappear. And that was what I found with the families of the youth. Many of them had no clue how to send money or how to set up the very basic things, phone for their juvenile, and so we assisted with those things. There's a lot of stigma. There are a lot of families who also grow tired when you have these juveniles that maybe have been going through the systems prior to the prison system. They've been dealing with the detention facilities, maybe Department of Human Services, and they grow very tired. And then you add in the stigma of family and friends and church and community knowing what you're dealing with, and so they become very silent. We believe it's time to stop the judgment and start the healing and bring families together and provide support. We cannot do this without the family unit being involved. And so we started working and helping families come together. Basically in May of 2011, we moved forward after we did a couple of letter writing campaigns. One was around the juveniles that we saw, and then the other was around the mentally ill that we saw inside of segregation and the conditions. And we started bringing all of these families together and ended up creating Citizens for Prison Reform. So it's a nonprofit organization. We meet monthly in Lansing. We have educational meetings to inform not only families, but we actually have some previous Michigan Department of Corrections staff who are involved as well, working to bring reform. We educate our elected officials. This is a photograph of one of our meetings, and my son is actually the third one in from the right corner. This was shortly after his release, so he's been out for 2.5 years and is doing fairly well when he's on his medication, but also we are now seeing the post-traumatic stress disorder really surface. And so it's an issue that a lot of these youth are going to be dealing with the amount of time they've been locked up and isolated and confined in their cells. So some of the things that we've been able to accomplish is we have a resource guide for families, teaching them how to navigate through the system. We now have a family, there's a family information packet on Michigan Department of Corrections website that's there because we went and shared our stories with legislative members, and they recognized that it was important for families to have the basic information that they need. One of the other issues that we're trying to address is prisoners who receive 2 substance abuse tickets lose their visits, and currently it's written up that they can lose their visits 2 years to life. So when you think about this, you have juveniles who are impulsive with mental illness. Often they cheat their meds. That's a substance abuse ticket. It can be something simple. So we're working to change that. It has now changed to 1 year. But we don't feel that that is enough. It's at the warden's discretion. And we also have been working to get a standardized authorization form created so that families can get information on their loved one. If you have a loved one who ends up in the hospital, you can't get that information as to why they're in the hospital unless a prisoner has signed this. And unfortunately, in the system with the juveniles, again, they don't take into account that they are not an adult in regards to their medical and mental health. They treat them as if they are an adult. So all of this led me to wanting to be able to have greater access to families. So I applied for a Soros Justice Fellowship, received that May of last year. And I have been able to work with the Department of Corrections. I have 4 pilot prisons where there are posters available in the prisoner units and in the waiting rooms, getting the information out to families. All of the guides that are available in Michigan are available on my website, downloadable. And I think some of the other things that are most exciting is that the director of the Department of Corrections has agreed to establishing a family advisory board under my project. And we are now meeting with them quarterly, working on the very issues that affect families and impact us most within the system. So that is the end of my presentation. I think the most important message that I have is it is so important, no matter what your role is, to really consider, are you including and engaging families in the work that you are doing or will be doing, because it's a very important thing.
Oh, she has a question, one question. We'll take a question.
Hi, I just first want to say thank you. I had another meeting, and so I didn't get a chance to stay for, I saw your whole presentation, but I'm missing parts of the presentation. But this
Deeply information around the juvenile justice system. I wanted to use this brief opportunity to remind you to please fill out this green sheets. This is our life support for continued work in terms of the seminar. And as a reward, you can take a pie, plate of pie piece home with you. And Dr. Villarreal will introduce our next speaker. Thank you very much.
So the third speaker is Kristen Stanley, and it was until I read her bio that I didn't realize that she and I actually go back further than with you. She currently serves as the Associate Director of the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency. She and I actually met when the National Juvenile Justice Network was establishing a nationwide leadership program for people like yourself who want to be advocates for change in juvenile justice. One of the things to sort of link to the previous conversation before I introduce you and to show you the widespread modifications we need in juvenile justice, Michigan is one of the states where a child who was accused of a felony assault loses their privileges as a child. Once charged as an adult, they will always be charged as an adult. So an example of this false gun, toy gun, that young man would have been charged as an adult for any subsequent offense. So the need for reform is really widespread. So let me introduce Kristen Stanley, who is really one of these reformers. She has a law degree from the University of Louisville, did a clerkship in Louisville, worked at the national level, and now has brought her talents to Michigan, where she and her colleagues are working to raise the age. Michigan is one of the states in the country where a youth is tried as an adult automatically at age 17. We're only one of 9 states that remain at that. And it's a serious issue because we see more and more of our kids going into the adult system. So while Kristen is trying to figure out her PowerPoint, I'll give you a couple more points about her. She also served as an appellate court for the juvenile post-disposition branch of the Kentucky Department of Public Advocacy. So the work that she comes to doing is not only from her passion, but also from being on the other side of the curtain where she was involved with a lot of these issues. And
hi. Apparently it wasn't saved up here, so sorry about that, guys. Okay.
so I'm going to just walk out.
That's fine. And Chico, thank you so much for
No problem.
introducing me. And you will all bear with me for just 1 second while apparently it was the wrong PowerPoint saved up here, so sorry about that.
Do you want me to talk?
Appreciate that. And Chico's right. So the work we've been doing, and I hopefully you all were able to receive a copy of the report that the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency and I co-authored, and my other colleagues. It's out on the tables, and if you didn't get a chance to get a copy, I'd be happy to get you some more. Just to let you know, so the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency, we're a nonprofit association. We focus on advocacy and research and technical assistance statewide in Michigan, and we work on both criminal and juvenile justice issues. I'm the associate director there, and I head up all of our youth justice programs. So the Youth Beyond Bars, and really this is kind of a prime intersection of all the work that we conduct, because we really wanted to focus on who are the young people that are entering our correction system in the state of Michigan. We had a general sense, an idea before we conducted this work, but we went ahead with research, a partnership with the Department of Corrections and from the State Court Administrative Office and a lot of other local court administrative offices to be able to gather information and research on what are the policies and practices that are leading young people to enter the adult system. Is this a problem in our state? There really has not been work conducted prior to this to really show, is this really a big issue? We know that these policies are on the books, but what happens in our state of Michigan? Okay, so in Michigan, we have a handful of states that, a handful of laws, that happened actually quite a few across the country. In the late 80s, early 90s, we had this wave of I would say more rhetoric, but a political wave of getting tough on crime. And while many of those big changes in law still exist today, so during that time period, we saw Michigan. Michigan has always been able to try 17-year-olds automatically as adults. This is a century-old law, but it was strengthened during the mid-90s during this tough on crime wave. A youth of any age in the entire state of Michigan may be tried and sentenced as an adult. During our research in the past 10 years, we found a young person as young as 10 years old that had entered the correction system for a crime that he committed when he was 10. He did not go into adult prison, but he was held on adult probation and has currently an adult criminal sentence for an act that he committed when he was 10. Michigan right now, we can try 14, 15, or 16-year-old kids in an adult court without a judicial hearing. Prosecutors have the discretion to automatically try and waive a young person at this age if a certain crime has been committed. Youth as young as 14 years old can receive a life without parole sentence in Michigan, and I know Dr. Hosington actually already spoke a little bit about that, but it is very significant, even more so now, because Michigan is really one of very, very, very few states, only 4, that does not allow a retroactive look back at those young people to see if those sentences were warranted, if there was other factors that were needed to be considered that the United States Supreme Court has delineated. But also it's important to note because in the entire state of America, the entire country, only Michigan and Pennsylvania house the majority of all life without parole juveniles. We have on average, I believe the last count was 360 people sitting on prison today who went in under the age of 18 and are sentenced to a life without parole sentence. And finally, which I think has been cut off but on your presentation and your books here, as Chico mentioned, you can be tried, once you're tried as an adult, for a felony conviction, you will always be tried as an adult. Also during these years, we see, during this time period, the tough on crime, the super predators, the violence, the fear, we see laws like zero tolerance in our school systems occurring, where you can actually push a young person out for suspension or expulsion if there are, mere threats, or we broaden the definition of what a weapon is, and there's practices are no longer discretionary but mandatory, things of that nature. So since these laws happened, right, what we're seeing though is a wave of a trending away from getting, to use the term tough on crime, but to use smart on crime. Not to just be rhetorical about it, but really we're seeing a shift in public opinion when you see public opinion polls. Just this week we saw a release of an opinion poll from the state of Michigan voters that say that about 2/3 of people do not believe that young people should be treated as adults in the criminal justice system. It's pretty amazing in Michigan only. This 91% is also a Michigan stat that was conducted about 4 years ago from the Michigan State University, showing that 91% of young people believe that young people should be treated in a rehabilitative environment with treatment, because whether or not they actually have read the brain science research, or really they just know anecdotally that we should be treating kids as kids and that they are amenable to treatment and they can change. Because of this kind of general change in perception, you see about half of the states in the country have changed their tough on crime laws. And arrest rates, because of these changes in laws, you see an arrest rate drop dramatically to a 30-year point low. This chart right here it ends in 2011, but since 2011 it's been going down even farther. We saw a very large spike in the mid-90s and again in the early 2000s, but has not gone back up at all. And the same goes not just nationally, but in the state of Michigan as well. But of course, regardless of all of this public change and opinion and brain science developments, we still have those really tough policies on the books. And so what we're seeing, and now these are stats that are more national stats, and I'll get more into our report that was very specific to Michigan. But what we're seeing across the country are consequences like incarceration increasing rates to public safety and safety of that person who's incarcerated. Youth and adult jails and prisons face serious risk of physical and sexual assault and self-harm. If any of you have been reading or listening to the radio, if you may know that the Michigan Department of Corrections is embroiled in a very large class action lawsuit for young people who are in their prison system that were sexually assaulted or raped or by either other prisoners or other COs or other members of the Department of Corrections. It happens right here in our state. It has happened across the country. Crime in terms of reoffending and recidivism. We see, and this is a stat that comes from the National Centers for Disease Control. A study was conducted that 34%, young people housed in the adult correction system are 34% more likely than their counterparts who are still housed, but in the juvenile system, with similar crimes, to reoffend much more sooner and to reoffend much more violently. 34% more likely. It's expensive. Our prison system, in case you were wondering, each prisoner who is housed in our prison system in Michigan costs around $34,000 per year, per person, to be sitting in a prison cell. And to not get that extra, there's not a whole lot of extra spectrum of services and things like that. You're really just to be there. And the lifetime earning loss, because what you'll see in a little bit, I'll talk about in terms of sentencing length and how long people actually stay in the system. Most of them will only have about like a 2 to 5 year sentence, so they will be coming out. Most people do leave prison at one point. But when you leave prison with a conviction on your record. Many times it's a felony conviction, or if it's a drug conviction, all these types of things that creates these big barriers to further employment, to further housing, to not having a job, to not being able to get federal funding for schools or further education. So it's been estimated in the state of Michigan, actually, that there's about a lifetime's earning loss of 40%, meaning that you can't be productive taxpayers either if you're losing that much percentage. And again, with the lifelong consequences to education and employment, it just goes on and on, the list of barriers and stigma that stays with you. So, that to reiterate, because I think we've heard a lot already from the other two presentations, but youth simply are not adults. We have research now that shows it. We have the United States Supreme Court that has ruled upon it in a long string of cases. We have federal laws. It was mentioned briefly, there's this acronym, it's PREA. It stands for the Prison Rape Elimination Act. Now the Prison Rape Elimination Act, it actually came into fruition around 2003, but the implementation was in 2010. And it requires a federal law that requires that all young people under the age of 18 must be housed sight and sound separate from adults, so 18-year-olds or older, in any facility. It does not require just prisons or just adult jails. It also means juvenile detention centers. It means any type of private residential facility. Any other place that there's a locked facility, they must be sight and sound separation. But you cannot do it by simply putting them in administrative segregation or in isolation. That is not the answer, and it is not what the laws allow you to do. So you must be smart about it. So with all of these things more of on a national scale, and the policies that we uncovered in terms of in Michigan that are leading young people to enter the adult system and how we got here today. Based on our work in the last, I say 10 years, obviously, it's since we conducted it, but based from 2003 to 2013, we found that 20,291 young people entered the adult correction system for an offense they committed before they turned 18 years old. So before their brains were fully developed, like was discussed, before they were still making these quick, peer pressure involved, influenced decisions. And about 6,700, which actually is about 1 in 3, of these people still remain under the Department of Corrections today. So whether they're still sitting in prison or they're on parole, but they still spent some time inside a prison or a jail facility. As of the date of our research, 87 youth were housed in, under the jurisdiction of the Department of Corrections, so that includes both probation and prison, and jail. Although none were actually in jail at the time we did our one-day count. Only 50 of them were in prison, and 37 were on probation. And this last number here, it really isn't about the one-day count this is kind of since 1996, since the laws became on the books, but it's a really important number. It may look kind of small, but 75 children under the age of 14, so we're saying 13, 12, 11, 10-year-old children have been convicted as adults in the state of Michigan since 1996. So because of that 20,000 number that I just had up on the screen, it's such a large number, we really wanted to focus, like, okay, well, what's the biggest population of who's coming into our system, how are they getting there? Not too surprisingly, because Michigan is only one of 9 states in the entire country that automatically tries youth who are 17 as adults. One of 9, so 41 other states have risen that age to 18. We weren't too surprised to find out that 95% of that big 20,000 number were there simply because they were 17 years old at an offense that was committed. So when we kind of broke it down and said, okay, well, what were the offenses? Was this because they were extremely violent? Was it because something happened? Well, what we found, focusing on that 17-year-old population, was that about 60% of them committed offenses that were nonviolent, that were property type of crimes, drug-related crimes, and crimes that did not involve a weapon. 58% of those 17-year-olds never had a juvenile record. In other words, never had the opportunity to be treated as a juvenile in the court system, never had an opportunity to be exposed to that type of treatment and to maybe be caught before they entered the criminal justice system. 55% of that big number, though, however, spent some time in prison, regardless of the type of crime that was committed. And a very interesting point, and I think should never be forgotten, is that when we talk about young people who end up deep into the system, and really just into the criminal justice or juvenile justice system in general, we see a large majority of them are youth of color. So when we broke down the numbers of Michigan 17-year-olds in this population, we found that 53% of this big number for 17-year-olds were youth of color. But when you compare that to the population of 17-year-olds of color in the state of Michigan, it's only 23%. So yeah, just kind of let that sink in a little bit. Now we were also interested to know, where are these kids coming from? Now it's separated into 2 columns because, again, that last slide focused only on 17-year-olds, but this large research project of ours really was broader than just 17-year-olds. We wanted to look at any young person under the age of 18. So, but to get into, to be able to enter the criminal justice system before turning 17 years old, which is an automatic charge, doesn't matter what the crime is, you go automatically to criminal court. If you're 16 or younger, you have to be waived up into the system. And a waived is kind of a more technical term that just simply means that someone made that decision, whether it was a prosecutor or a judge, that this kid should be waived or moved into the adult court system. Now, there are certain types of offenses that are much more serious that allows a prosecutor to make that discretionary choice to waive. And there's also an option called like a traditional waiver, where a judge can make that determination based on a 2-part hearing. And there's a third option, what's called it's a designated proceeding in Michigan. It's a little bit unique to the state of Michigan, which is what's similar to what Lois was talking about with her son. Now, you have the option to be tried as an adult but stay within juvenile court, but you are given an adult sentence. You're given a blended sentence because you have to go to a juvenile program, but you have an adult conviction. You have that one last shot, and if you don't screw up, then you'll be okay, but you'll still have that adult conviction at the end of the day. So we still consider that as being waived because you still have an adult charge, an adult felony on your record when you try and get back out into the world. So going back to this, we found that when we look at the 17-year-olds only, many of these counties aren't too surprising. A lot of it is based on population. This is not too surprising. It's not so surprising to see Wayne, Oakland, Macomb, Kent on the top of the list because that's where most of the people in the state of Michigan live. So you're going to have more 17-year-olds simply based on population enter that system. Now, when we look in terms of waiving a young person, which is this other column, 16 or younger, 75% came from only 10 counties, and the number 1 county wasn't Wayne County, in case you're interested. It was Berrien County, a county much further away that also has criminal justice issues, but it was not the one that I think many people kind of automatically go to in terms of, oh, this is the top place in the country. I'm sorry, it's the place in the state that you see a large impact of criminal justice. And again, that column, the red column, the 16 or younger, has a lot to do with based on the discretion of the court practices and the discretion of the prosecutors in their courts. Now, we were also able to kind of unpack more traumatic involvement, like types of histories and violence histories and past statistics based on prior research, and we unpacked that research and saw the population we were focusing on. We found in the state of Michigan, of young people who were tried as adults under the age of 18, 78% prior to entering the system had a friend who was killed in their lives. 48%, or about half of them, had a family member who was murdered or killed prior to that young person entering the system. So they'd experienced already a lot of trauma and violence in their life. Their home life, we see that about 78% lived in a single mother household, 47% relied on public benefits, 81% had a parent with substance abuse issues, and this statistic at the end here is really quite shocking to me. When we think of kids who enter not just the juvenile justice system, but go further in and are tried as adults, 44% of them were also in foster care at one point in their lives. And while of that 44%, they were on average placed out of home 11 times. Before turning 18. Before all of this happened to them, before turning 18. And again, family incarceration. You see, this is something that there's a lot of research showing that there's a lot of generational cycles that happen with 45% had a father in prison, 25% had a mother in prison, and we see 19% had a sibling who was also incarcerated. We've heard a little bit already in terms of the mental health issues and education and just kind of barriers to learning and kind of understanding of this young population. Well, not too surprisingly, it gets even worse once you're incarcerated because you have less positive environments and more barriers to your learning. And so prior to entering prison, we saw that of the 17-year-old population, about half of them, 48%, entered the prison system or entered the criminal justice system with a 10th grade or lower average education level or reading level. Or, I'm sorry, not reading level, had achieved that age. So that was the only marker that we were able to understand was what the Department of Corrections had. Someone had checked that box that they went to that grade. I don't know if they completed it or what it means, but that's what these numbers are, and that's how it was reported to us. Again, the same goes when I say that because the same goes with folks who entered the prison system had substance abuse problems. So at that point, that means that they were able to find an indication that that young person had some sort of substance abuse history. And the same goes with mental health treatment prior to prison. 25%, a quarter of them had treatment prior to entering the prison system, or prior to entering the criminal justice system. But we do know that the prison system, as has already been presented, exacerbates any type of underlying issue, or really just any type of underlying issue. And we found that nationally, 68% is estimated have a psychiatric disorder since they've been exposed to being in a prison system. Again, 48% of them had already been committed at some point in their lives to another type of facility. We did kind of briefly did an overview of what the process of the system and how they progressed. Not just how they got there in terms of what type of offense or where they're coming from with their life histories, but what type of legal representation did they have. Not too surprisingly, they did not have, most of them took a plea agreement, which is not too uncommon in the criminal justice system in general. In terms of jail time, and this is both, jail time is actually for a sentencing option. On average, half of the population received some type of jail time. Whether it was only for a few days and it was comped, or you were given kind of a discount on your discount. Your years were taken off your sentence once you're in prison, or if it was actually your entire sentence. But we found that on average, if you were given some sort of jail time, 145 days was your typical time length. And 35 days was your typical length in terms of awaiting a hearing or trial. Add those together, it actually equals a full year of school. So on average, these kids were spending an entire school year in the jail system. And of course, on probation, we were interested. Now, these numbers, a majority of these young people actually ended up having some type of probation as part of their sentence. But we were very interested to know if probation, if there was a violation of probation that led to an increase in the system. That if you violated some sort of charge, you didn't have a clean drop, if you will, or some sort of thing that you were violating your probation, did that escalate you into prison? We found that only 16% of the young people who ended up in prison as a sentence got there because of a violation, which was a much smaller amount than we assumed. So, to talk more about the population that actually ended up deeper inside a facility, inside the Thumb prison facility. Right now, as of the data collection, we found only 50 young people, 17 or younger, in the system. But to go over to this isolation little stat here, 6 of that 50, so almost about like a tenth, if you will, but 6 of them were currently in isolation, so in their own solitary confinement units. And we see that stat, and if you kind of marry that with the lacking educational programs, we found that young people only get an average, and that's a high, 8 hours a week of school. It's a high estimate. We found that in terms of misconduct, while there's been an attempt to change how young people are dealt with getting misconduct orders, because if you get a misconduct order, you get too many of them, you end up in isolation. In 2008, the Department of Corrections tracked that there was about 300 misconducts in December of that 1 month, and that's for young people. That's for people under the age of 18. It dropped down to 88 in 2010, but because they changed the system, they maintained a regulated schedule. However, unfortunately, those are the last 2 years that they kept track. So that was the best that we can show in terms of if you have a scheduled order, if you have programs throughout the day, if you're able to give them a broad spectrum, something to do. You can drop those misconducts, but it's our understanding that hasn't really been kept up. And again, I've already mentioned earlier in my presentation that violence and victimization, there is a current lawsuit, and I think that that number 500 has actually risen since the time that we did this study. And finally, so I did mention really briefly that many people do not stay in prison if they are imprisoned or in jail or on parole for a very long time. This is not something, when we talk about life without parole sentences, 365 since the 360 people since the beginning of that law, so that was in 1996 when that law was established. That's how many, and that's a very large number, and I'm not trying to dispute that, but when we look in terms of the broad length of 20,000 plus people, it's not the large population. Many of these young people do not commit homicide offenses. In fact, in our last count, 2003, we found for the 17-year-old population, not a single homicide offense was committed by a young person who was 17 years old. So these are not necessarily your most violent people. It's simply, especially when we're talking about 17-year-olds, it's simply because that's what ended up happening in the process. They either didn't have a good defense system, they had prior histories, they weren't being given that opportunity at some point to stop that cycle. So right now, we have about 1,400 young people who are formerly young people on parole. 61% of them had a maximum sentence of 5 years or less. 98%, so pretty much all of them, have a maximum sentence of 10 years or less. And I say maximum because in Michigan, we have both a minimum and maximum sentencing scheme, so that you could actually get out much before that if the parole board allows it. But again, once you are out of the system, once you entered the criminal justice system and you went into prison when you're 17 years old, and you never graduated high school, and you were never able to drive a car, and you're never able to go to prom, or go to the grocery store on your own, or open a bank account, or live on your own, frankly. You have to come out and find housing, you have to come out and find a job, you have to come out and be able to just be a productive citizen that doesn't commit another crime. But yet, you have all these felony convictions or criminal convictions, so there's a lot of barriers that are established with that, and you weren't able to give, to really just actually mature as a young person would, which, like many of us in this room already probably would have. If you can imagine yourself at 17 years old, what were you doing? And I also like to kind of point that out. So with all of this research and with all this understanding, and in partnership with a lot of our other folks around the state of Michigan, we came up with a slew of policy recommendations. I'm fortunate enough to say that there are policymakers in Lansing who have taken up a few of these to kind of put together. There's a package of bills being drafted right now that are focusing on youth in the prison system. One of them, which is first and foremost, that we see will affect 95% of this population, is to raise the age to 18 immediately. Because frankly, those 17-year-olds majority of them were never given a shot in the juvenile justice system to have rehabilitation or treatment. Secondly, that we should see young people removed from adult prison facilities and adult jails. because it would have prevented the class action lawsuit that we have now currently against our state, exposing them to violent and sexual assaultive behaviors and environments. That we have facilities in the state of Michigan that are already serving young people who have an adult sentence, or have a blended sentence, or violent offenders that need to be kind of removed from society for a certain period of time. But they do not necessarily need to be in an adult facility while they're still kids. And there's a slew of other things that I wanted to kind of focus on partnering with families and victims. I don't know if Lois mentioned, but we work very, very closely with Lois in her family participation program. And we're really excited to know about the Family Advisory Board within the Department of Corrections. And there is a bill being drafted to kind of legitimize and make this to give the Family Advisory Board more legs. Because we really understand that when young people are re-entering into our society, that the number one way that you can rely on re-entry programming or anything, it really comes from your core family support system. And whatever you define family is, I mean, it's not necessarily your nuclear family. Family has a much broader term than that, but it's really about your support system. And so that we don't see people cycling in and out of our criminal justice system and causing much more havoc, we want to make sure that we are partnering with those families and victims to make sure that we can kind of stop that cycle at some point. So I believe that is, that's it. So thank you all.
Come up in front. We're going to take questions from the audience at this time. Questions?
Oh.
Richard?
When you think about these kids who go in,
Sure.
how many of them are getting extended sentences for things that actually happen in the prison?
That's a really great point. Actually, would you like to talk a little bit about that? I know that it comes up with your families a lot.
Could you repeat the question?
So the question is, so if we're talking about young people who haven't matured enough, they react to being in a strange environment, and they have a lot of misconducts, misconduct, there's a lot of policies in, when you're in the Department of Corrections, if you assault a CO, and an assault is a very broad term, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't be there for safety issues for the correctional officers, because it should be, but those can actually add sentencing length to that young person's stay within the prison system. And so the question was, how many young people do you see having their sentence lengthened because of misconducts or disruptive disorders while they're in prison? I know more anecdotally than actually that actual fact based on the work that we were able to compile, but I do know anecdotally that it happens quite frequently, that misconducts are given more broadly to young people because of this. We understand that they react, right. They're teenagers and they're going to prison.
At the same time, they're targets.
Sure, and they're targets, you're absolutely right, and there's a lot of things they have to do to kind of become more masculine. And I talk more about men than women, but I can't forget that, women comprise about 10% of that population. So it's the same fashion where you have to become more aggressive because you're thrown into an aggressive environment.
So I don't have the number. It's something that I would love to get, is the actual number of those who have received additional charges. My son was one of them. That's one of the reasons why he ended up doing 5 years of prison time. So he had an assault on an officer while he was in the psychiatric prison, while he was off from medications. The officer received a nickel-sized abrasion, and the officers or the staff can just choose if they're going to press a felony and take it to court, and it's a done deal. Now, the 16-year-old whose letter was on the right, while he was down there in that mental health program where he was not being gotten out and not getting groups or the treatment that he really needed, he ended up with 2 more felonies, one for spitting and one for throwing a chair, that resulted in, I think, an officer got hit by the chair, and so he ended up with 2 more felonies. I see it over and over and over again in regards to the juveniles, but also with those who have significant mental illness, which is the case with a lot of these juveniles.
Especially with those.
Yes, absolutely, yes. Sure. Sure. Okay.
I really happy to see that the policy recommendation, the last one is partner with families and victims, because according to your earlier presentation, it's more about the family that who are already in the prison that may have the impact of the juvenile who will end up in the system. So I really don't see anything about the peer pressure. I understand peer pressure is a factor, we talk about it all the time. But actually, according to my understanding, the family relationship can trump the peer pressure if the family is in a good relationship. So I was just wondering, the partner with family and the victim seems a little vague to me. So is it possible to have a system to require, for the juvenile, again, to require the family member, at least one member, to be educated or to participate in the
Sure, and I actually think that there are courts, the court system, especially the juvenile court system in Michigan, it's county by county. And so I have found, and I think there is a judge in this room that might be able to answer your question better, but I have found there are a few judges across the state that do order families, or at least a parent or a guardian, to be involved in the process, to show up, and I've seen that. The problem with that, of course, is that if you make this a requirement and you fail that and you violate it, and you're not looking in terms of this family member, it's a very, how do you get that person into the court? You know, is it because this mom is working like 2 jobs and can't get off, doesn't have any transportation, and then you're going to violate that person who's sitting in front of the courtroom even more because the mom couldn't be there? It becomes very complicated, but yes, I have seen courts that have required that. And I've also, but I think that what we're trying to do, in that policy recommendation, we're really promoting the Family Advisory Board as being a part, and to encourage the Department of Corrections to broaden their visitation policies. We've seen research from other states, such as Minnesota is a great example, where they conducted a research in their Department of Corrections to show that when prisoners got more visits from family or supportive networks while they're inside, they behaved much better, they got fewer misconducts while inside, and when they came back out, they recidivated less. So that we saw a much lower level of reoffending. So if we encourage family members to become a part of the process, we can already, ensure that they're going to stay out of the system longer. So that's really where that policy recommendation comes from, more on the back end than the front end. Sure. I think
this gentleman had a question.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I have 2 questions. One is do you have the data on the dollar value of rehabilitation resources, like education and whatnot, in the juvenile system in Michigan?
Yes, I do. So in terms of their usefulness, or in terms of how much they cost per day, or how much?
Well, I just want to know how much money, because I know the largest budget for the state of Michigan is the MDOC,
Yes.
but Department of Corrections. And I know that there's a big disparity between what goes for each student as opposed to how much to...
And not only just students, but we're talking about higher education, all sorts of things. The Department of Corrections trumps any other budget. And you're right. If we're talking, it's a little hard to kind of say, like, well, each juvenile program costs X amount of dollars, because unlike the Department of Corrections, there's actually a very broad spectrum of services when you're talking about the youth justice system, or cross sectors, like whether it's education or family therapies or things like that. There's a very broad spectrum of costs. So more on the low end, we estimate kind of your community-based type of programs, which is more of like a more low-level probationary, more wraparound type of thing. You see that costing around like $25 to $50 a day, types of things. But if you're talking about a juvenile facility, so your more high-end secure facilities, Maxi facilities that DHS run, or state-run juvenile secure facility, and we also have a private one, which is run by the Wolverine Human Services, which is up now closer to the Lapeer area. Those you see costing closer to around like $250 a day per person. But you have to understand that you're trying to fit the kid into the type of program. I mean, it's the opposite, trying to fit the program to the kid. And so that there should be a broad range. Now, if you're talking about the Department of Corrections and $34,000 a year, it's a one-size-fits-all. It doesn't matter what it is, or who the kid is, or what they're coming into. That's it. That's what you get.
So, and the other question is, you have data on the...
Sir, I just wanted to offer a slightly different response to that.
Sure.
The Justice Policy Institute has a report up on their website. In Michigan, we know that the average cost for education for youth is approximately $13,000 on an annual basis. The corrections budget is about $100,000 per person on an annual basis. So there's some economic data there that you can look at real quickly.
Okay.
that's better than me.
And the other question is, do you have the data for the racial breakdown?
Mhm.
Because I didn't see that in the presentation.
You're right, I only had a very small portion of it. What we're conducting right now, based on this information, is a racial impact analysis, because we were very fortunate to be able to work with a lot of these bigger departments that collect a lot of information. So what we are finding, and I can just a preliminary research, is that while you see almost about the same amount of youth of white youth and youth of color who are being arrested on a statewide basis, but you see a much larger proportion of those youth of color entering not only jail, but receiving a prison sentence. So the prison sentence is given much more frequently to youth of color than it is to youth of color, regardless of the type of the offense that they are committing. So it's a preliminary, but sure.
I have a question.
Sure.
I noticed some of the data set 42. Are you in the process of updating it?
No, it's a really, yes. No, it's a really great question. I really wish that we could maintain a continual feedback type of with data from the Department of Corrections. One of the bills and the packages of bills that are being worked on is to actually require both Department of Corrections and SCAO, which is the Supreme Court Administrative Office, to maintain an updated tracking system of youth who are tried as adults.
Okay.
So we're hopeful that that'll actually, because it took a lot of time and effort to piecemeal all these systems and their data information together. But 2013 is as close as we could get for right now.
Oh, okay.
Sure. But we have it broken down by each year, so it's not just an aggregate of 10 years. It's from 2003, 4, 5, 6, and so we have each one and all that breakdown. Yep, sure. Sure, Sue. Go ahead, and then we'll go to Sue.
I was just wondering, I know with the adults, we have tried to divert those who've gotten mental health, who have had mental health issues in the past into a program that is for, it's ours here in Wayne County, and I think it's the pilot program for adults. It's called mental health diversion program, basically. Do they have anything like that?
Repeat the question.
Are there any juvenile mental health diversion programs? Is that right?
Yes.
Kind of similar to, so in Wayne County, there's a mental health diversion pilot site within the court system here. Is there something comparable on the side for young
For
people?
those who've had some kind of
Yeah.
contact with the mental health system.
Right, so youth who show some sort of need for mental health services.
Because I saw you had your numbers said that.
Sure.
there were a low amount who have.
And that, again, this is for numbers of youth who are being tried as adults.
Right.
So those young people, so actually youth who are tried as adults no longer qualify for juvenile services. They would actually only be young people who, and that's actually a really great example of where those young people kind of fall through the cracks. Now, if you're trying to pay for them through the mental health courts, and then maybe you're very familiar, Medicaid does not allow them to be paid for.
And that's what I'm saying.
Right, and so this is a policy problem. And so that the dollars don't allow, the federal dollars and the federal funding streams don't allow for people who are under the age of 18 to be paid for in an adult service like a mental health diversion court. However, in the state laws in Michigan, if you were tried as an adult, you were an adult. You do not qualify for juvenile services.
Yeah, but
You cannot be served, but you have to make a waiver. So I know that right now there's a pilot program in Wayne County where the Juvenile Assessment Center is taking 17-year-olds and assessing them at the Juvenile Assessment Center out of the Wayne County jail system so that they can get assessed for certain services, but they cannot be served by those CMOs in this county.
right.
And regardless of whether or not they are still chosen
That's why I brought the
developmentally.
question up. If they're going to look into.
They're looking into it, and I think that that's part of all of these, making these changes to these policies right here will put us more in line in federal funding streams and put us more in line in the federal, with this Prison Rape Elimination Act, which there's money that's attached to that. If states don't comply with the PREA laws, we don't get certain dollars from the Department of Justice. So
Probably
that's types of,
the reason your numbers look so low with regard to when they're coming in, that
Right.
they touch bases with the,
Right.
touch something with.
and it's also about who's reporting. So again, those numbers came from the Department of Corrections. So is it a self-reporting stat? Is it the young person saying, yeah, I went to a therapist once? Is it, how do those types of, yeah.
But you're showing that they go up once they get into.
They are,
it.
right, and so you're
That's-
showing, right, and we're able to assess, once they're inside the system, how much contact they needed with a therapist inside, or how much need they had afterwards.
Well, what about the trauma of them being incarcerated?
Precisely, and I think
mean,
that
you
that's
gotta
what we were
think
trying to
of-
assess before, right, exactly, because PTSD is a big problem. This, yeah, so, well, thank you, and it looks like folks are going. Sorry. Yes, sir.
Just a question, just kind of along those same lines with the emergence of specialty courts and things like that we've had here in the state of Michigan. What are your thoughts on like the juvenile drug courts? I know there's a few of those
There are a
that
few.
sprouting around across the state.
Yeah, and I think that they're very promising. They just have to be conducted well. I think there's folks who see that as a really great option of a diversion program where, these kids don't come out with an adjudication and you're able to divert them from going, and catch them basically from going deeper into the system, especially with a drug offense. Drug offenses are considered those nonviolent offenses. If drug offenses are considered as like a much broader issue. I think maybe you can talk even more about like using drugs, maybe it's some sort of indication of some sort of self-medication or some sort of other issue that's kind of lingering. So I think it's a very promising program. I think that there's a kind of say that like, oh, we don't need another specialty court, we just need to simply change how these kids are entering the system altogether. I've heard that as well, kind of weigh both sides.
I think one problem I'm seeing with the specialty courts, though, is that most all of those courts, the counties are each determining who they're allowing in and who they're kind of catering to. But most often, anyone who has had a violent offense, they are disqualified. And unfortunately, a lot of times with the mental health and the drug courts, they do end up being somebody who has some type of a violent offense connected to them, and therefore they often cannot get into the program. So that's
again, I think there's complications with funding streams of them. So if we're talking about, how do we maintain this, but yet not allow certain violent offenses to come through the door? How do we maintain this with using maybe Medicaid dollars, but yet we have a 17-year-old in our population who's in the adult court? It's a lot of these types of things where we have Michigan laws that are just simply out of whack with the federal funding streams and the federal laws, and I think that we would be able to better support those types of versionary courts or specialty courts if we had different policies in the books. Sure. I'm sorry, Sue, did you have a question? I'm sorry. Okay. Sure.
Okay, I still think that the family is a very important factor. For example, there are a lot of parents or some family abusive situation that directly or indirectly cause the juvenile victims.
We've seen that, yes.
Right, that is totally a big factor. So I was just wondering if it's possible if the juvenile, if we found out that when the juvenile criminals, we can understand the background if the abusive situation exists. Is there anything we can? I don't have the legal background, so I don't know if this is too complicated.
That's okay. No, it's fine.
To process one crime and then we process another crime. But we are talking about.
Typically, juveniles who have a history of abuse in the home do not reveal that during their trial. The statistics are very high, but the high percentage of those individuals never reveal that during their trial. And that's because of embarrassment, poor representation, and there's multiple reasons. But that factor is not brought into the picture when the sentence is being passed along to them.
So maybe we can a little bit more proactive to explore.
I agree. No, I agree completely, and I think that that's why the work at Lowe's is doing, trying to engage the family in family engagement or family empowerment, to have that type of voice where you want to be able to have the sentencer or the person who's sitting in the bench look at that person holistically as not just a person who committed a crime, but like came from a certain house, came from a certain environment, and this is what led to this behavior. And so you have to, but again, we need to have proper juvenile defense so that somebody who's sitting in the courtroom can actually say that. Unfortunately, we don't have a very good juvenile defense system in Michigan. And that's a really big issue. Yeah.
And so I want to point to you as well that we have systems who often work to exclude families. So it's not just that families aren't present or aren't there, but often, for instance, in the detention facilities, we were told we couldn't speak to the psychiatrist who was going to be treating our son at the age of 10 and 11.
He was underage. Right.
So I just want to make sure that you also understand that sometimes it's not that families don't want to be there or can't be there, but often
they're not educated, or they're not given the opportunities by the very systems that should be working with families.
No, I have no assumption.
Oh, no.
But I do like to hope that, we are talking about recommendation, can we allow or even recommend the system to include, to proactively include them, or even to force them to be part of
I think so.
the-
I think so, and there are glimmers, and that's why I kind of said that there are glimmers of that happening. And I think the strongest way to make that happen is actually to have a more cohesive defense system, so that we have advocates who are standing up for that young person, who know that this is their client, and this is someone that they need to stand up for and advocate through each type of procedure throughout the process.
Well, Lois brought up a good point too. If a juvenile offender violates their substance abuse rule, taking an extra pill, they react by withholding visitations from their most powerful support structure for up to 2 years. So now you've got a brain that's moldable, flooded with all types of different neurotransmitters and chemicals related to their puberty, and you're reinforcing a behavior of prison life over the behavior of a parent who can come in with a loving parent that can come in and provide a scaffolding for this individual. So you're cutting off something they desperately need at that point.
But yeah, I agree with it, yes, and that is part of the whole package that we're trying to change.
Well, I believe that juveniles should not be fully accountable for what they committed. But if they are being abused, the family should pick up the responsibility.
Sure, there should be some sort of support, yeah, and I think that there should be accountability on the part of the young person as well, but do it appropriately.
You talked a little bit about the cultural differences also, and why do some kids get into trouble? Why do some cultures have a high incidence of problematic behavior that leads to incarceration, and other cultures have very little? Some cultures celebrate the youth, the adolescents' independence. They provide ways for them to take risks, but they put a sound barrier and protection around them as they take those risks. And that's a huge difference in the cultures.
But the legal system saying that adults, the juvenile under 18 is not fully responsible. So the legal system is not consistent with itself, right?
You would think so. Then that's why we're here today.
So they can understand what they really need, the support systems that they really need, and helping these children with literacy. But a lot of them have kids who are already static in this area. Lovely. And children too. We really need to be really.
Oh, yeah, sure, absolutely.
Because we're in Wayne County, I'm sure those numbers, if you just look at the Wayne County numbers.
And we do work
alone,
quite a bit, and